we should be working in this together. We should be figuring out the best interest of your client, marrying that with the best interest of the other side. And that's all done with information. Information, knowledge is power.
Yeah. And I think that the more information you have is going to prevent all the hiccups that happen. Not all the hiccups, but many of the hiccups that can be avoided. You have the information on the front end. So just gather the data to have a smoother transaction. You won't regret it. Welcome back to Real Estateable, your go-to podcast for raw, real, and relevant information in the real estate world. Today, we are talking about writing offers, and it's as simple as this may sound. If you don't work with a lot of buyers, if you've never had a buyer, this episode is truly for you.
Yeah, and I think that it's sometimes if you're not surrounded by the right professionals in this industry, you have some pretty basic questions, and we're here to help answer those to kind of simplify the process for you as a professional so you can put your buyer in the right light as you're presenting offers on listings that you're offering on. All right, let's dive right in. So we recently had a agent that we work with in our office, and she came to us, came to Ashlee. And what was the question that she asked you, Ash?
She just basically she has only worked with a few buyers over the couple years, year, I should say, that she's been in the business. And so she's like, what do? I have a buyer and I really just don't even know what to do. How do you write an offer? Not so much how do you fill out the form, but how do you pivot and how do you know what direction to guide your client into? And so I thought it would be the perfect topic to talk about on the podcast because it's about to be the spring market. Interest rates are starting to drop a little bit. So it's going to start being this frenzy. So we just want to go over kind of like the process that we do to write an offer.
Yeah. And if you're not practicing over and over again consistently in a condensed period of time, it is going to take a little bit more practice and a little bit more time. So do not feel like, okay, I'm completely clueless. The agent we're talking about has done a lot of business, but not consistent over and over again practicing this. So don't be afraid to revisit this episode if you in 6 months are like, okay, wait, back to buyers. And having a ton of listings is not a bad thing. Honestly, I wish that's what I looked like when I first started. So, definitely use this as a source of reference, but let's talk about you're out showing, you've got the mapped out showings for the day and you're panicking in your soul because you're like, what do I do next when they find the perfect one? So what would you say there, you're walking through a house and you're like, okay, I know we're going to need to talk about offer strategy walking away from this particular property. What next?
So first thing I always check is how many days has this property been on the market? Because, if it's day one and it's hot on the market, you might not have as much room to negotiate. So days on market is a huge indicator on how the house is kind of performing. And if that leads me to check the price, is it priced correctly? But days on market is the first thing I'm checking just for the initial check.
Well, and I think too, when you're talking with your client, your walk away from there, I don't think that you need to set up the whole conversation about what they should be negotiating and offering while you're sitting in there. You still have to do a little bit of research. So you could quickly check days on market, but you also need to be checking the history of that actual property. So maybe this current MLS is X amount of days on market, but when you go back and you're sitting at the computer and you're really pulling comps and comparables to see what does that look like for an actual offer for your client, you might see that this house has been listed a couple times. That actually just happened to me where it wasn't a ton of days on market, but when I look back, this house had been listed for almost 2 years. And so at the same price, no
That's
price
just
reduction.
So crazy.
Yeah. So it's like, when you look at that, don't look at only days on market for the current listing. Make sure you're looking at the big picture, but you're not going to be able to pull that while you're sitting in a property. So you need to make sure you're setting yourself up for, hey, it's going to take a little bit of research for me to best represent you in guiding the decision and how you're going to offer. So very quick. So while you're in the property, as you're preparing the what's next, days on market, super great thing to be saying, hey, this has been 1 day on the market, regardless of what I'm finding, don't know that we're really going to have much negotiating room. But anything else that you kind of use to put together to kind of set the stage on like the what's next? Because that's the stuff that I think we have to be prepared for, because you're sitting in front of a client, waiting for the, oh my gosh, I need this house. What's
Yeah.
next? And you don't have the opportunity to reference this episode on the way home or to call another professional. So anything else that you do while you're there in the property with the client?
One thing that you mentioned about checking the history. So not only just checking to see, how long it's been on the market or if it's been listed multiple times, see how many times, if any, that it's gone under contract and fallen out.
Mm.
And this is where you can kind of find out some details. A lot of times it'll say the financing fell through, but sometimes that might mean it didn't have a good home inspection, even regardless of what it says. So I think that calling the other agent or texting, if that's what you prefer, I like to call because I like to build that rapport with the agent, so they kind of get to know my personality versus just reading a text. But just asking them, hey, why did this deal fall through? Can you tell me anything about the home inspection? Can you tell me anything more about the property? What is your seller's motivation? What are they looking for in an offer? You can find out a lot of details just by calling the agent, and then you can structure your offer based on that conversation.
Yeah, and I will, if I know, because how many of you guys feel like you walk in and you're like, okay, we're going to be writing an offer. Like we don't even have to go upstairs. Like you
Mhm.
already know this is going to be the direction you're going. So that phone call to the seller's agent for me sometimes happens as they're finishing up a showing. I might not ask every question that you're talking about, like, seller's motivation, etc. But I do start the conversation, and I'm the same. I try to get on the phone with the agent, and right now, agents, guess what? They're back to answering their phones. Shocking epiphany on that. And so, but I'll just start the conversation just so that I can say, hey, I've made connection with the agent. Here's the status of any other possible offers. We've looked at days on market. I did see that this house came back on the market. I did ask that preliminary question. But then I also will make another follow on phone call to that agent, because the more that I can build that rapport, like Ashley is describing, the more that we can become, buddy buddy, the more I feel like they're going to be actively working to help, the best interest of both parties.
Well, and I think too, just building the rapport, and you said like buddy buddy. Obviously, you don't have to be best friends with the agent, but if you can just show that you're friendly and show that you answer the phone and you're responsive and you're on, on task, that goes a long way because they're going to say, "Hey, Tiffany's working really hard for her client. Tiffany's communicating with me." And I feel like communication between agents is probably one of the number one complaints that we hear about all the time is, well, this person's not getting back to me. I haven't heard back from the agent. I don't know what's going on. Just start the communication, start the relationship off right with the communication with the other party.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So anything else that you're doing while you're with the client, in the conversation that you're having, that, okay, I think we're going to be writing an offer. I'm going to be walking away. I'm going to look at comparables, make sure it's not grossly overpriced, and see kind of like what we can be doing to put together an offer. Anything else in person with them?
I always bring a copy of the property condition disclosure. That way we're both going looking over it kind of together, versus, hey, here's this form that you need to sign. I like to point out, hey, this is where it talks about where the how old is the roof. This is where the plumbing section is, just so that they, if there are any questions on that form, I can also reach out to the agent on the way home and say, hey, we noticed that the roof is this old, etc. Um, but I think just having the most knowledge, and it's going to give you the power in writing the offer.
Yeah, and if you're on the fly, like this morning, it was like right now is when I'm going to make this showing happen. And if you don't have that, I always use that for follow up. Like, hey,
Mhm.
I'm going to be sending you before I leave the driveway, I'm sending you a digital copy of what they probably have seen from other showings. And I want you to go through that. I have found, like, honestly, the last like 2 to 3 contracts I've written, those sellers haven't finished that form completely. And so in the state of Tennessee and Kentucky where we sell, disclosure is law. In Kentucky, it doesn't matter your time that you've been vacant in that property. In Tennessee, there is some exemptions, but when you go through that, there, that form should be filled out completely. And
Mhm.
there's been several times, so that gives you an opportunity prior to you offering to be like, hey, they missed the whole section about flooding. Like, Can you get your seller to complete this so that we have a complete form to be providing with our offer? But I don't stress if it's on the go where something pops up or the convenience of a showing happens and you don't have that with you. Follow up with that before you even leave the driveway so that they can review in the same manner. They can, review over your phone while you're sitting there, etc. So very good point as far as just knowledge is power in them making a decision.
Yeah. Okay, so what would you say, let's kind of break down a scenario because I think that that would be helpful. So say you go to your showing and the property has been on the market for 25 days.
Okay.
Where are you headed with your client and where is that conversation going?
So I try really hard to not put any kind of information without me being backed with information. So I don't try to put out any information because here's the thing. If 25 days on the market and we're $50,000 under comparables, that's a different conversation than 25 days on the market and 50,000 over comparables, right? So I try really hard and there's no possible way that, and especially if you are not super experienced, like there's maybe a way I could run a really quick and dirty CMA while they're still looking around the house, but I also need to be looking at the house too. So I cannot be heavily
Mhm.
distracted. But I try really hard to not drive decisions without having facts. And so in person, if we're talking in person, I don't do a lot of pricing conversation. Um, I do kind of say, start to think about what you're comfortable with. Start to think about, you've seen this house in comparison to the 10 other houses that we've seen. So we kind of have an idea, but without having those facts, because what I don't want to happen is us have a complete conversation sitting in person that we're going to go this direction. And then I sit down at the computer and realize that's never going to appraise. And
Mhm.
now I have them 2 hours in feeling comfortable and moving in their head already because they're doing that. Numbers or not, they're moving in to this property before you've even written an offer. And you don't want it to be where you have to backtrack from something they start to feel comfortable with. So I'm super, super adamant about not doing that in person and not assuming that the numbers will be there. The biggest problem I think right now that we have is getting properties not under contract, but to closing. And so we've got to do our due diligence through that process. Things like condition, things like, different things like a roof, like negotiating that ahead of time. You have sellers that are a little too close for comfort right now. And so they are doing everything they can to negotiate to get under contract, but then are they going to negotiate a new roof, a new water heater, a new HVAC when you knew darn well that was a 30-year-old
Mhm.
HVAC going into the offer? So we have to be thinking and slowing down and also managing expectations for the buyer. So in person for me, long story long, in person for me, I'm really, really, really slow to having decisions made in that. Now I also have done the approach of whether or not it's so hard because so many buyers right now prefer to be on their couch reading, reviewing contracts and not coming to the office to meet.
Mm.
But one of the things that I have done in the past, and one of the things I always offer is, hey, I need 2 hours. Like, let me get 2 hours together, and then we're gonna review everything together and write the offer together. As a new agent, that seems extremely daunting to go, I'm gonna get all of my comps and comparables and be ready to write an offer and sign that in front of them all in one swoop. So I could see where that's difficult, for a newer agent. So how do you address that? Like, what's the expectation walking away? Are you gonna review comparables and then
Mhm.
okay, another hour, now I'm gonna be writing an offer. How do you
I
address that?
like that you said, "Give me 2 hours," because I never do a time. I'm
Mm,
always like, "Let me go back to the office and do it right now." And
mm,
so then sometimes I feel like I set my client up for a certain expectation, and then maybe it's not met because I'm like, "I'm gonna do it right now, do it right now." Well, I know it's an hour drive back to my office, so there's an hour right there. I like to just basically tell them I'm gathering the facts. So, "Oh, okay, so you think you need your closing costs covered. Let me get with your lender and find out how much the closing costs are going to be so we know how much to ask the seller for." Again, that's getting the information that you need to write the offer. "Hey, you guys aren't going to be here until March. When would you like to close? Are you looking to close maybe in end of February, or figuring out some of the answers ahead of time that you can. And again, it's just having that information. But I don't necessarily talk about price. I kind of talk about if this if it's this scenario, then we can do this. But if it's this scenario, we'll do that. So kind of just before I have the data, I'm like, if we can go this way or we can go that way, it's just going to depend on what I find out from the other agent.
Mhm. Yeah. And you said a good point too. You have to take into account the needs for the buyer. So
Hmm.
you might be 60 to 90 days from an actual time frame that you need to actually be closing. And so, if you have options to be able to reoffer again because they have a longer time frame before they actually have to have keys to a property, you might be more aggressive or maybe not. Depending on, whether this is like, hey, we got to offer and be under contract
Hmm.
this weekend because we need keys in T minus 30 days. That's a different scenario. So I think that when we play like you said, hey, let's run through a scenario on this. There's so many different pieces to every buyer that you have to consider and be able to pivot based off of those needs, based off of the responses from the seller, based off of the comparables that you're finding. But I think that what we want to equip you with today is like, what are those key points of like the step by step of what you should be gathering and at what point should you be doing that. So while you're in that property, we're looking at days on market. We're setting the expectation that we're going to be looking at comparables. We're making a preliminary phone call to the agent and just asking them if there's any history that we need clarification on, confirming that the property condition disclosure is up to date and is filled out completely. So I think that those are the four things as you're sitting in the property that you're making sure are done, setting a timeline. And here's the thing too, there's sometimes like this morning, I showed that the property in the window that I had. If there was an offer that was to be written out of that, that's not a 2-hour window that I'm writing that offer. I went from there to another appointment to, sitting and being here with you guys right now to I have one more window that I have to get through before I'm going to sit down and actually be able to do that. But it was important for me to get in front of my clients at that exact time. So with that, walking away, I would have been like, okay, by this evening, we're going to sit down and have another conversation about what I've found out. In the meantime, we're going to be checking with the lender. So let's talk about the lender because I think that right now, the lender side of things plays in a whole big
Yeah.
part of that. I mean, I was just working with that the buyer with a specific housing grant and a specific seller contribution that had to happen in order for us to get an acceptance. And so that was like the must haves, and that kind of created what I had to be offering to the seller.
Yeah.
So what are some other things from the lender side that we should be
So
looking
actually,
at?
the other day when I was showing my client, they were they're getting 2 pre-approval letters. So they're kind of just shopping lenders. So they had one pre-approval for one amount, and then they got another pre-approval from a different lender. And I said, we had shopped in 2 different price points at this point, and I said, what are you comfortable with around spending? Sometimes people are like, "Oh, 300. I know I want to stay at 300." But now more than ever, it's about the payment. I want my payment to be $1,700. I want my payment to be $1,500. So that's you going back to the lender. Hey, how much can my buyer spend in this zip code? Maybe they're looking at land, or maybe they're looking at a house that has an HOA. You have to give those details to the lender so that they can kind of give you a payment estimate, and that will tell you what price point you're shopping in.
Yeah. And once they have selected a property, do you usually like, okay, we know we're offering on 123 Short Street. It's a popular house in
Yeah,
Clarksville.
so popular.
It's so popular. It just keeps on coming up. But 123 Short Street, that's their decision. When you walk away and you're getting the closing cost estimate, are you also getting an exact payment estimate as well
Yeah,
for that property?
they usually send that too. They'll do like a closing worksheet and then an estimated payment amount.
Yeah. And I honestly, so I've learned this lesson by wasting my time massively. That payment is the minute that we have that is like my walk away, even before I will call the agent to talk to them a second time about follow-on questions, because that payment estimate might be we're not offering. For
Mhm.
whatever reason, the taxes might be a little bit higher. It might be a situation of flood insurance or just whatever it could be. Now, I know several of our newer agents that are not running, a million miles an hour. They're getting payment estimates and closing cost quotes prior to those showings. I think that's difficult if you are showing 10 houses
Mhm.
at one time, or like this morning, hey, sure, I'll meet you there right now. Got an appointment and I'm there. I don't necessarily think I make good practice of that, but that might be something that you could be doing if you work with a lender that's willing to continuously give payment estimates. If payment and price is just a sticking point for your clients, that may not be a bad thing to do ahead of time either.
Well, and I've said this 100 times. I was when we bought our house, we were super house
Hmm.
poor because we didn't know what our payment was gonna be. We were just like, "We love this house and we're gonna do whatever we can to get it." We moved in and then we're like, "Well, we have no money to do anything else except be in our house." So, I like to just be upfront and say, "Hey, this is what your payment's gonna be." I let them do the math. If they can live comfortably with that, then I'm good with it. But I definitely don't wanna make anyone house poor.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that we drive those conversations from like
Yeah.
the very first buyer's consultation. So driving even further home, you're talking from day one. It doesn't matter what you're qualified for. Is it 1,500? Is it 2,000? Is it 2,500? That's what we're basing all of this on, not the fact that you're qualified for a million because you're really great with debt to income.
Yeah.
So I think that we have, the 4 steps while we're sitting in the house. So in the car driving away, definitely the lender call, getting the lender estimate, and then the expectation of finding the comps and comparables, and then follow-on phone call to the agent. And I think there's so many different questions that can be asked as far as that goes. But is there anything else that you feel like would be helpful to kind of point out that you're asking the other agent? Any of those hard questions that you just are like, there's no way they're going to tell us, but you still ask it anyways? Because I feel like sometimes agents, I'm like, ooh, if I was that seller agent, I would not be telling all that business.
Oh, there's a girl I follow on Instagram, and she posted something like, "You can ask another agent," and I don't remember how she worded it, but she basically was like, well, always ask what's important to the seller, and most of the time, they're gonna say highest net. I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty much every seller's, desire. But, she said something, and it was basically like, "Oh, if you have an offer on the table, is there anything that I can know to make my offer more competitive?" And maybe that's not the right way to do it, but if you can squeeze out any information, you should. One thing we haven't talked on is talking about how bad does your buyer want this house? Because that is ultimately going to change any offer, regardless of condition, regardless of a house being overpriced or underpriced or asking for closing costs. Um, when the agent from our office called and was asking me about how to write an offer, how to negotiate, at one point I just kind of said, well, how bad does your buyer want it? Because that's what it's gonna come down to. That's gonna if it's a little different, if different scenarios, days on market, multiple offers, those are all gonna be factors that you are going to encounter when you're writing an offer. But it comes down to, what is your buyer comfortable paying? What are they comfortable negotiating or going without? And I think that that is something that you're gonna have to identify probably at the property. Sometimes they'll go home and discuss it, but you need to have that conversation of, how bad do you want this house? What are you willing to pay for it? Like, if this is the one, what is it gonna take?
Yeah, and I think that that's, again, gonna be different for every property. Even with the same buyer, it's gonna be different for every property or every offer that you make. Because I think setting up the expectation that you might have to offer a time or 2, beforehand, and I try really hard to not let a buyer be like, "This is the absolute one," to remain flexible through the process. But the reality is that there's some times where
Mhm.
they're like, I just have to have it. And so we need to be the sounding board. And I also think that you have to be the reality check in, okay, great, you absolutely have it, but every single one of these floor plans has sold for $15,000 less. So there is no way, unless you're making up that $15,000 difference, that we are going to get an appraisal from 4 houses that have sold in the last 30 days that are the exact same thing for $15,000 less. So I think that you have the reality check of what needs to be done, and you have to marry that with I have to have it mentality as
Mhm.
well. So, so when you're walking away and you have that buyer's motivation, I think that that helps you kind of craft, okay, what more or less should we be asking for and what more or less should a buyer be doing? Because here's the thing is that you can't offer a massive amount off of asking price when a buyer has to have all cost covered.
Mhm.
And they know that we're going to need to have a new roof because the lenders are going to require it because of whatever scenario that you're up against. And you also have to have an extended closing when this is already a vacant property. And well, man, if that is the absolute one for them, where are they going to give to be able to make that
Mhm.
happen for them? And you can't sit there as a buyer's agent and expect, even in a great buyer's market, cannot expect that the absolute world's going to be handed to them and then they're just going to show up, willy-nilly to closing without any skin in the game themselves. So don't set that expectation up. Absolutely try to negotiate that, but it's not the expectation that should be set up because you don't want it to be where they're like, "Okay, I'm just expecting that the seller's just going to do all of these things." Okay, cool, but you're not even putting earnest money down. There's no
Yeah.
good faith money is be even putting down. You really cannot allow that to be the expectation that's actually going to get to a successful, a conclusion for your buyer.
I also think too, if your buyer does want to ask for a lot of things, try to offset it. So the conversation I had last night with my buyers, their closing costs came in kind of high. We were going to offer around list price, and I said, "Ooh, your closing costs are this much. I think we should bump our offer up a little bit to offset the cost and the net that the seller is going to make because we are asking for other items." Like there's a septic tank on the property. We want to make sure that that's been pumped in the last 18 months or so. So just some different things to kind of offset like, hey, we are asking for closing costs, but we understand you're still trying to net your money and cash in on your equity. So just like you said, just having the flexibility and giving and taking it throughout the process.
Yeah, and I think just almost requiring your buyers to understand through the process that's the case. You cannot like literally scrape every single last thing out of the barrel and expect a seller to go, "Sure, let me sign right here." Yeah,
Yeah.
no
Well, my
problem.
my favorite is well, they only bought it for 150 and now they're selling it for 250.
Yeah,
It's like
5 years later,
yeah.
hello.
So
You would hope that that's what's going to happen for you, Mr. Buyer. Like that is the
yes.
point of the risk that you're taking in real estate. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. That is a difficult one to overcome as well. So
Okay. So let's break down the steps. Kind of like simple steps of what we've talked about. So step 1, you're going to the property and your buyer loves it.
yeah.
Step 1.
So we're going to look at days on market real quickly. We're going to make a preliminary phone call to the seller's agent while you're in the home. You're also going to set up an expectation of the time it's going to take based off of the day that you have in front of you, the time it's going to take for you to get the necessary information wrapped back around to them as well.
And then next, you're going to call the lender and figure out the payment amount and the closing cost, especially if you're asking for closing costs, but also extra, especially if your buyer has to pay for that because you want to be upfront, as much upfront as you can, and give them as much information as possible.
You're also going to make sure that you have the seller's disclosures that are applicable for the state that you're in, making sure those are filled out completely, that the buyer has access to them, has had ample time to review that, has asked the questions that are needed, and following up with, again, timeline and relationship building with this seller's agent. We want to make sure that there's multiple phone calls being made through the process. So following up and asking what is important, asking this exact question, what is important to the seller? And if you're competing with a multiple offer, what is it that you can do that's going to help this process along? Um, and maybe put your offer more competitive than the one that they currently have. Don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else that we missed?
I think that just from there, breaking down the comparables when you're looking through
Mhm.
that, just having a real hard conversation if the numbers look a certain way. And the other thing too, I would say, and this has happened quite often because I feel like we have a lot of professionals that are not equipped to have really hard conversations with sellers. So, you can list a property at $1 million, even if it comps out at 100,000, right? And so those agents can do whatever lawful instruction that they agree to do for their sellers. I would say if you are finding a gross difference, and I mean 900,000, that's
Yeah.
extreme. But let's say you're finding where you're like, I like literally every one of these floor plans has sold for $10,000 less. And you're talking like a 30 to 60-day window of closings, and it's the same floor plan. Like it is so black and white. Does that ever happen? Probably not. But if it is so black and white and you are just not finding it, go back again to a third time with that seller's agent and go, can you provide the comps for me? I mean, my folks are super interested. I think we're getting ready to write you an offer. But when I'm finding, supporting numbers to be able to help them decide what they would like to offer, because they're making the decision on what they're offering, um, I'm not finding the numbers to help them make a decision to help get your seller the asking price that they're asking. Challenge them to give that to you. There's no reason that they should not have those right at their fingertips because they are actively working with that seller, pricing, repricing, looking at those numbers. There's no reason they can't be providing them to you. And to be honest with you, self-checking yourself that,
Mhm.
we're not appraisers, we are licensed professionals that are just providing data for decisions to be made legally through the home buying process. And so do not be afraid to be asking, show me the numbers.
Well, I think too, if you every agent's different, but I think that if you can provide the comps too, hey, these are the comps that I found. What comps were you using when you were pricing? Because then it
Mhm.
shows like you did your homework too, and you're not just like, hey, give me some comps so I can make an offer for my buyer, you know?
Dang, I didn't even think about just saying, "Show me your comps," and not providing them
Yeah.
back.
Well, I mean, I feel like some people would do
Yeah,
that.
they absolutely would, and I might use that actually. Before I get started, show me your comps.
Show me the
Show
numbers.
me the numbers. Can you do my work for me? But that's so true. I could see where people would totally do that.
Yeah.
I might be like, "Okay, roll away. Can you send me your comps?" But no, for sure, if you need help supporting those numbers, and if you are in a scenario where you're going to challenge an appraisal value, I have a situation right now where we just got a reconsideration for an appraisal, and I think all parties involved agreed that what we had in contract, which came $15,000 less than what we had in contract, we're like, "Where is this appraiser coming from?" We did a reconsideration to try to keep the deal together, and sure enough, that appraisal came up to where we were. But it was funny because looking at what the seller's agent provided and what we saw, it was like, is the appraiser even in our same real estate market? It was so far off. They was like, "What is going on?" But being able to have all of us equipped with the right information because a buyer easily can be like, "Phew, it's not worth that. I'm not paying $15,000 more." But I had already equipped them with the right information. And then the seller's agent came in and I was like, "Girl, you should be an appraiser, not a dang," to the way she put it together. But I think that just knowledge is power. And really, we got to be focused on, as an industry, the best interest of all of our clients is to get the ball moving forward, right?
Mhm.
And so we should be working in this together. We should be figuring out the best interest of your client, marrying that with the best interest of the other side. And that's all done with information. Information, knowledge is power.
Yeah, and I think that the more information you have is gonna prevent all the hiccups that happen, not all the hiccups, but many of the hiccups that can be avoided. You have the information on the front end. So just gather the data to have a smoother transaction. You won't regret it.
Yeah. And I think having the relationship building process with the other side, with the seller's agent, that also helps because when it came back, we could have all been up in arms and I could have been like, "Oh, puffing my chest that the buyer's not going to overpay for this house." And she could have been puffing her chest as well and going, "This is ridiculous. There's no way the seller's going to reduce for this." And I think instead it was a collaborative spirit to go, "What just happened?
Yeah.
Let's step back and look at this. Let's compare numbers, compare notes, talk with the buyer, see what they're comfortable with." And really what happened, and I'll wrap up this situation. We had a seller, the buyer said, "I don't mind sending in for reconsideration of value, but I'm not going to spend the 3-week possibility if I don't have a guarantee that we're going to proceed past that." And the seller said, I'm not going to agree to $15,000 until I know that the higher ups have not actually reconsidered value. So what we did, the win for both parties, it said if the reconsideration did not come back favorable, that the seller would agree to sell at that price. And the buyer said if the reconsideration does come back at the higher amount, they agree to pay that price they've already agreed to. So I think that collaborative spirit in that was like, okay, where's the guarantee for the one party? Where is the, the thoughtful consideration for the other? And I think that you guys have got to be really sitting in the seat of collaborative, cooperative spirit. We are charged to be doing that in this industry, and you guys need to be putting that at the forefront. And all of these tips and tricks that we've gone over today, really have that in mind. But also that's the key to it. I mean, to a winning offer,
Yeah.
there's
Well,
your secret.
yeah, and I think too, just providing that like excellent experience to the other agent, so that way when you go to offer on the next listing, oh man, I worked with Tiffany before. She's super great, always does her stuff on time, really responsive, all the things. That's going to put you a leg up over someone else who's like
Mm-hmm.
ghost town.
I mean, I think about that. Like top 10 agents would love to work with again.
It's because they talk to you.
Yeah.
It's because they update you and
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. And easily the scenario with the reconsideration, easily the agent could have only presented what would have been beneficial to her seller. Instead, it's like, hey, let's look at both sides, and doing the same on our side as well. So tons of really great information today. I feel like thinking outside of the box, but also making sure that you're just thinking through, and don't panic. Oh my God, so freaking excited that we have a buyer ready to offer. Oh my gosh, what do I do? What do I do? You already know what to do. And if you forget, come back and reference this episode. If it's another 90 days before you write another buyer offer, you need to re-watch or
Yeah,
re-listen
refresh.
to this. Yes, for sure, for sure. Okay, so we are all over the place, back and forth with all kinds of different tips and tricks and ideas, and taking the high energy of your excitement that your buyer is ready to offer on a property. What is something, Ashlee, that you haven't been doing or maybe had stopped doing that you took away from this episode that you're like, okay, I got to get back to great practice with this one tip?
I think it's going to be two parts. Collaborating a lot with the lender and also collaborating with the agent. I think that just having the relationship, the good working relationship, because well, one, lenders can refer you business. So if you have a good working relationship and a transaction goes smoothly, that's a positive for you. And it's also a positive for your client. But just being able to talk to the other agent, get as much information as you can, that's going to help you structure your offer based on what the seller's wanting, because you already know what the buyer wants. So getting as much information from the other side is going to help you write a competitive offer.
Yeah, I think that's really great points. And I think that for me, it's the reminder of looking ahead past that appointment and setting a realistic expectation of how long the timeline will be for them to actually write an offer. And I think that sometimes that requires you to shift some stuff around, because you have a high charged, high excitement buyer that's walking away from that closing. If you're like, I'll get to it at 6 p.m. tonight and it's 8:15 in the morning, probably not the best representation for your client. So I think that you have to make sure that you're setting up the expectations, but then also being flexible with your day that, hey, it's changed. We got to have some priority move around because I'm ready to write an offer. So for me, I think that I need to be communicating that consistently every time that we walk out the door, ready to offer. What is that going to look like? And what is it that I can do to shift around my day? Because priority is offering 10 out of 10 times right now in this market.
I need to do that too.
Yeah.
I said it in the episode, and then I was like, when you said that, I'm like, yes, that is the one thing, because I don't do the timeline. I'm always like, okay, I'm going to go write that up, and whether or not I have another appointment, or I do try to express like, hey, I do have something else at this time, but I'll get to it right after. But I like just saying like the hour, like, hey, and give me a couple hours, give me 2 hours, and I'll get everything I need. And we'll circle back together.
And I think you can also, to help with that too, is 2 hours of radio silence is going to drive them crazy, and is that best service
Mhm.
to them? During those 2 hours, "Okay, I've just connected with the lender. As soon as I have that, I'll get it over to you. Okay, got this back from the lender. Here you go." So it's not 2 hours of
Mhm.
radio silence, but I think it's the expectation of when they think that they're gonna sign in the dotted line, when they're meeting back with you, when they're going to receive, a video outline of what the offer looks like. However, you're gonna be meeting back around with them, that shouldn't be 0 conversation until boom, you're ready to write an offer.
All right, guys. Well, if you found this helpful, make sure you give it a 5-star review and a download. You can find us everywhere on social media, and we will see you next time on Real Estateable.